All right, so we are going to start with a very simple animation that will use the 3D capabilities of After Effects. So I am going to take, and you all will take your own name first and last, and you are going to flip that first name up, pivoting on a 3D point, and then your last name is going to flip up and do the same. So as you watch these play, they are not squishing and enlarging, they're actually flipping up. I also have a little bit of motion blur on it so that everything looks a little smoother. It's harder to tell without being able to see it in full frame rate, but that is the difference, is basically a little bit of blur on things makes it flow a little bit better. So let's do this thing. I am going to recommend that you start a new composition, and I am going to call the new composition name flip. Since I already have one, I'm going to put a 2 after mine. You don't have to do that. And a black background is perfectly acceptable. All right. So first, I want to get my first name working. So I'm going to go up to the top, and I am going to click on the text typing tool, however you want to call that letter T up at the top. And I am going to click somewhere in my space. And as you can see, the last font I used was gigantic, so my red cursor line is super tall. So I just shrank it down over in the character section so that it actually would look okay as I start typing. And I'm going to type my name, and I'm going to do my first name first. Now, why am I not seeing anything? Well, I'm on a black background and my text is black. So I'm going to have to go to my font color, and I'm going to have to change it to something else. Let's go with a lovely green. It would help if I highlighted my text, because at that point it was only going to type new things in green. So I had to go back and highlight over my stuff to make that work. All right. And then obviously, for whatever reason, the letter B didn't show up. All right. So there is Bryce. Now, if I try to move this into the middle of the screen, which is not, of course, where I'm really going to put it, but making my point, I can see the anchor point down here. I switched over to the arrow tool, which is the letter V, before I grabbed it so that I was no longer typing. Okay, sorry, I missed that step. But I'm dragging it around, and hopefully you're seeing the little weird crosshair anchor point at the bottom, sitting outside of your actual bounded box text. I am going to change my font because this is a little dumb. Well, maybe taller is better. Yeah, let's go with that. All right, so I'm going to make it a little big, and I'm going to put it here just so that it's hopefully easier for you to see. Now, dealing with your anchor points can make a big difference as to how things are going to animate. And as you can imagine, it's even more important if you're doing 3D stuff, because what is where, when you say rotate, is it going to rotate from? The middle of the word, the end of the word, a place outside the word? What is it? So we would want to move this around. So if I click on the layer that I'm messing with, which right now I have 1, and that's my name, and I hit the letter A, then I can get my anchor point controls. If I start dragging these numbers, and I think the first one is your left to right, so you've got an X and Y, you can see that the anchor point isn't actually moving. Its relationship to the anchor point is moving. So if I wanted to pivot this around, then I would need to get it a little closer to the text than what it was before. Ty, you have a question. Feel free to ask that question. Unmute yourself and ask away.
Sound, my anchor point moves with it, and even if I adjust the positioning of my anchor point, it still moves with it. Is that normal?
Okay. Yeah, it should not. When you move your text around, it should move with it. Yes, but when you move
Okay.
the anchor point down at the bottom, your words should move and your anchor point should not move. Kind of
Okay.
like what I'm doing right now.
Got
So
it.
I'm playing with the numbers at the bottom. Okay. Now, a couple of keyboard shortcuts that are worth noting. Okay. Let's say that for various reasons, maybe the last thing you built, your anchor point was like weirdly off to the side. And let's say we're not going to, you can try this, but we're going to have to undo it because our animation is based on a different kind of movement. But let's say you built a thing and you're like, man, I really wish my anchor point was in the middle of that. There is a way to do it. On the Mac, you hit Option and Command together. On a PC, I guess that would be Alt and Control. And then there's this button up here at the top, and I'm going to circle it because I have that cool capability. Circle it up here, and look, it's making it green, just like my text. That's interesting. But yes, there's a little box up here. It looks like a dotted line square with 4 arrows pointing to the inside walls of that square. Okay, that is the box we want to double click on. So on my Mac, the Alt and Command held down, it would be Alt and Control on a PC. If I double click that, it moves the anchor point to the center of the object that I'm currently pointed at. So as you can see, it's no longer out to the side, it's actually dead center. That's pretty cool, but not exactly maybe what you want. Now let's say I want to dead center that whole thing now that the anchor point's in the right spot. I want to dead center it to the screen. I can hold down Alt and double click it and it will auto center. Yeah, cool. Cool how it didn't do what I said it was going to do. That's awesome. Really. Okay. Well, it's supposed to center the object on the screen, but it's not. So if I move it, let me see. See, it's not letting me move it because I'm not on the arrow tool. All right, so if I double click it now, interesting. Okay, so pay no attention to the Alt double click method because apparently it did not do for me just now what it did when I was first testing it. But the point is, we also talked last class, I think, about the alignment controls that are over here on the right-hand side of the screen. So if I want my name centered from top to bottom, then I would probably use the Alt and Control, or on a Mac, Alt and Command double-click trick to put my anchor point there in the middle. Then I could say, okay, center from left to right, center from top to bottom, and then boom, it would go dead center in the screen based on the shape of the object, which obviously this is a very symmetrical rectangle that happens to be made up of words, but it's essentially a rectangle. So just know that if you drew something that's really odd shaped, it might center it in a way you don't want, which is why it's important to know how to move the anchor point manually. What I want you to do is create your first name and create an anchor point that is a distance a little below the word, basically what I have here. Once you have that, make sure that you again are using your selection tool or the arrow, which is also the letter V just by itself on the keyboard, and then move it approximately where you want your first name to go. My first name is 5 letters. My last name has more than that, so I'm going to go a little off to the left so I have some room for my last name. Now, what's nice is since I've already done some of this, before I make my last name, I could just duplicate the layer. So I'm going to go down to my first name and I'm going to do Control on a PC, letter D as in dog, or on a Mac, Command D. And then I just made a copy. And now I can actually say, yes, that's cool, that's my name, but I'm going to drag it over. And I'm going to go to the text tool and I'm going to change it to be my last name. And apparently I can't type tonight. All right. So here's a good example. I know the anchor points match on these because I copied it, right? So it kept it. It is just like the original version of what I made. But my alignment is a little jacked because I manually dragged it over. So instead of trying to eyeball this perfectly, I could say, oh, let's go back to that align trick. And although I don't want to center it from left to right, I do want to center it from top to bottom the way I did before. And I can do that with both. So I could go back to Bryce and I could do that. And now I know they're exactly the same and they're pretty much close to centered on the screen. Okay, so once you have your first and your last name there with equidistant sort of anchor points from the bottom of each of those words, we now can turn on the ability to do a 3D move. So normally we've been doing basic position controls, right? We've slid it top to bottom, slid it from left to right, and at the very most scaled it from small to big, which creates the illusion of coming from far away and coming towards the camera. It's all an illusion, but the point is that's not actually a 3D move. That is a scale illusion. So to make us able to do 3D things, we have to basically tell the program that we want this layer to have 3D attributes. So I'm going to start with my first name, which happens to be on the bottom. It doesn't matter. I could put it on top. Maybe I'll put it on top. All right, so I'm going to go to my first name layer, and I am going to toggle the toggle switches modes button at the bottom that we have to mess with sometimes to change what options we have next to each track. I'm going to go to the toggle switches thing and flip it over so that now I get these cute little icons. If you remember, we went here before to get the motion blur, which was the little circle that is repeated multiple times here, and it gives you the blurring effect. If you look 2 places over from there, there's a little cube icon. That is 3D. So if I click on that for my first name, new controls come up that I didn't have before. All right. So what we want to mess with, what we've basically said is, okay, there's an anchor point. I could be moving things around and rotating around the point, not just left to right or up to down, but in 3D space. So if we go to the X rotation and go to the second number of the two, what would be like the Y if we number if we were doing position controls, and I start playing with it, you will see that my name tips forward or tips back. And especially at low frame rate, it's probably hard to tell which is which. But the point is, it actually allows me to pivot around that anchor point in a way I have not been able to do up until now. Now, if you look, the arrows are showing you the different dimensions. So if I go in and circle this, there is a blue arrow that we have not had before that is showing the Z axis. The red is the X, and then there's a Y one that is hard to see right now because of what else is going on. But if I pivot it a little bit, whoa, if I pivot it a little bit, you'll be able to see it. Yeah, it's green, so that's why it's green on green. So green is Y, red is X. But the point is, it's trying to show you, hey, I can go any of these directions, including at you or backwards. So what we want to do, waiting for me to say, what am I supposed to do at this point? Well, again, I wanted you conceptually to get that. We're going to lay down our word by basically pivoting it backwards, which means we're going into negative X rotation. And we are going to pivot it until it is so thin that we don't even see it anymore. And because of camera position and stuff, even though we know mathematically for it to be a perfect pivot, it should be a 90-degree angle. The reality is our camera is positioned in 3D space. It's an imperfect position, so it is 94. The magic number is negative 94. That, for me, with mine, is my flat point. It might be different for you. The reason I'm making a big deal about that number is if I don't want to take as long to do my last name, I know that I can go down here and promote it to 3D to get my controls, right? So we're doing the same little cube button. Go to X rotation, go to the number you were dragging on the other one, and we already know what the magic number is. It's negative 94. Hit return, and boom, it's as if my name just disappeared. I can still see, of course, the sort of tracking visuals, but those wouldn't be in my export. It would just be invisible. Now, as I drag down my timeline, nothing is happening because we didn't set a keyframe when they were sitting straight up. So we need to set a first keyframe. Should have done it before I moved down the timeline, but I could actually just go back to the beginning of my timeline. So if you haven't moved at all, go ahead and go back to the beginning and hit the stopwatch next to the X rotation that we keep tracking with for both of your tracks. So for my first name, I'm hitting X rotation stopwatch to set the first keyframe. And for my last name, I'm going to X rotation and setting a keyframe. Now, go about a second down the timeline. About a second is fine. And you can set a manual keyframe first, which is, there's nothing wrong with doing that. And I've kind of been having you do that so that you walk through the process a little safer. But just so you know, if we had just gone and adjusted the rotation, it would have manually, or I'm sorry, it would have automatically set a keyframe for us at that point. But that can get dangerous because every time you touch something, you don't realize you're setting keyframes. And I've been trying to teach you, set it manually first then make your adjustment. So as long as you're patient enough to do it that way, I will tell you it will keep you out of some trouble. So we just manually set a keyframe. Right now it's exactly the same because we didn't change anything yet as our first keyframe. But we can go to that keyframe and say, yes, instead of -94, let's take it back to 0. And boom, my name stands back up. So I just set the X rotation back to 0 for this keyframe, and I'm going to did it on my first name. I'm going to do it on my last name as well. And if I hit 0, it should take it back up. Now, as I scroll down my timeline, you will see my name stand up. And you can kind of tell it's a 3D effect. It's got that sort of Star Wars opening credits sort of angle to it. If I stop in the middle, that kind of shows you, yes, that's 3D space, real actual 3D space now. But they're coming up at the same time. Well, you should know how to fix that, right? Stagger them. Pull your last name out a little bit, and then boom, the first name will come up, and before it's done coming up, the second one starts coming up, and then they both stop. Oh, they stop kind of jerky? Well, that's because they're linear keyframes. We know how to fix that. Right-click on the keyframe. On the ending keyframe, go to Keyframe Assistant and do Easy Ease. Go to the one for my last name, do the same thing, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. And although, again, it's hard for you to see because we have such a terrible frame rate, now my name sort of eases into a stopping position. You might want to set your range, your workspace range to like no more than about 3 seconds, and you hit the letter N to block off that. Remember, we're sort of bracketing the only part we want it to play when we loop it. So when I hit spacebar now, it'll keep looping my animation. And I've got a nice little delay there between the two names, so it looks a little more elegant, and they smoothly stop. So the only thing left is our motion blur, and we already know how to do that. So go to the circles with the sort of echoing circles behind it for each of your tracks and turn it on for each of them. And when you play it now, it should blur a little as it comes in. If you can't tell that it's doing it, then just park in the middle of the move and see if you can't in fact tell that it's blurring. Now, the amount of blur that it's giving it is supposed to be related to the amount of motion that is happening. So that isn't completely true. I mean, it's motion blur, but things get more blurry the faster that they move. So if you feel like, oh, it's not doing much and your little like flip up is kind of slow, then just move your keyframes over a little bit so that it has less time to get from the laying down position, and it will move faster. And you'll notice that there's the blur is far more obvious when we do that because more motion blur is being added because it's doing it faster now. All right, so that's a way to sort of understand there isn't a more motion blur setting. It's related to how fast things are moving and how drastic that movement is. And our moving isn't very drastic, so speeding it up was kind of our only option to make it look good. Yes, Ty, you have a question.
Yes, I just forgot the button to set your render length.
Yes, B is for the beginning one. It's set already by default, but the letter N, which
And
is next
thank
to
you.
the B, the letter N will close out your range. Good question. These are easy things that
Thanks.
I have to be careful to not take for granted that it's been a week since you heard any of this, or in this case, 2 weeks, right? So very simple animation, but kind of cool. Has a little more complexity to it than what we've been doing because you're introducing 3D ideas. And as you get into more complicated stuff, you can get in and make some things 3D, some things not. Maybe you're doing something in the background that doesn't need to be that complex, but your foreground elements, you absolutely want them to fly in a different way. So that makes perfect sense. All right. Now, if does everybody have it working? And if you do not have it working, raise your hand. All right, I like the silence. Awesome. So what you can do is once you've got it working, I'm going to close and collapse my stuff, and I'm going to open only the anchor point. So I closed all the stuff that was open because it was a whole lot of clutter, and I'm just going back to hitting the letter A. So now I have the anchor point for each. And you'll notice your anchor point had only 2 variables before, up and down, left and right, X and Y. Now there's a third one, which is the Z axis. So if you move those numbers, You're actually moving the object in 3D space. So I would say take that last number and zoom it in by basically scaling it up to make your words just a little bit bigger. Now, we're not going for bigger, but I want you to see what it's going to do to it to move this element. So I just scaled them both like to a 300 depth. I didn't do that one very well. 300, that's 2 zeros, Bryce. Come on. All right. And I'm not real sure why my text, oh, I guess it's because it's moving. Yeah. Okay, because I was parked in a weird place. But if you'll notice now, they are still pivoting around that odd anchor point, which means these come sliding down as if they're mounted on the end of some invisible pole. So it's kind of a cool way to recognize, ooh, that's a move. There's no way I could have pulled that off in 2D space. I'd never get it to look believable. The only negative here is that because of camera relations, my pivot point for my first name doesn't work now, right? When it was in a different 3D space, it was flat, but now I've moved it to such a degree that it's not flat anymore. So you got to sort of understand, and that's part of why we wait so long to get into the 3D stuff, is that all this stuff becomes very relational. So you make one adjustment and then you realize, oh crap, it messed up something else. So we were messing with rotation. So if I want to fix that, oddly enough, my last name's fine. No, actually, it's not fine. Now that I think about it, it's not up yet until we get this far in. Let me zoom my timeline in a little bit so that makes more sense to you. So if I change this to reveal rotation controls, I hit R and I get a whole bunch of different rotation controls. I just wanted to see my keyframes. Yeah, so the first one, it's waiting for my name to show up so it's not visible. Now I could just decide if I want it to be invisible, maybe I'll just delay it by a frame. So I basically have a nice black frame at the beginning and then poof, it pops on just as it starts to flip, and the same thing happens with my last name. But I wanted you to understand again that the 3D space changes what the moves can look like, and that you might even find clever ways to make adjustments in here to something that started off as a very simple idea but gives you a much more complex payoff. And that's the thing, right? Once you kind of know the tools, you start experimenting with them. So, cool. All right. I am going to stop recording because I think that is the gist of that exercise.